Hi, I'm Katherine Mangu-Ward. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Erica Grieder. I'm the Southwest correspondent for The Economist based in Austin, Texas.
And today we are having a very special Mormon-tastic episode of Blogging Heads.
I think we should do it every time.
Before we get to Mormons, let's start out with the topic of the day. Why don't you kick us off with your thoughts, feelings, other musings on Dominique Strauss-Kahn and his surprise reversal of fortune?
Well, it's not the most cheerful story we've seen in the past few weeks. It does seem that it followed all pretty logically from all the events described. And looking over the past 6 weeks, I can't say that the initial arrest was faulty, but it also seems that they're on stable ground in suggesting that they'll no longer go forward with the prosecution. What's your read of it?
Well, I mean, I actually think you hit on an interesting point, which is it kind of seems like everyone behaved reasonably given what they knew at the time.
Right.
Which is not always, especially when you combine the awesome power of international politics and maybe French politics in particular, and hotel chambermaids. I mean, you're very rarely going to actually get a scenario where you say, well, everyone did their best. But I actually think that is kind of what happened here, which makes it all the harder, I think, for people to maintain the desired levels of outrage, right? I mean, I think one reason this story got so much play is because people really enjoyed being angry about it from both directions, and
Right.
now it just kind of seems like this fizzle instead of a bang. So
I think the French are very resourceful in their capacity for political outrage at the United States. So we'll see that go on, I think, for a while.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, on both sides, there's still these high feelings about whether the prosecution should go forward, whether it should have happened at all. But I mean, at what point would anyone have intervened and said, this is just a terrible way to do this? We can't really expect much more than that.
Right. So this weekend I was in the what might be sort of the quintessential chattering classes stronghold. I was out on Long Island. I was not actually in the Hamptons, but I was pretty close. And DSK was all anyone wanted to talk about. And I think there is this sense by a sort of certain class of people, this sort of internationalist, citizens of the world, that this is their scandal in a way that, your various and sundry, Democrat and Republican representatives don't belong to them or aren't sort of part of their world, but that somehow Dominique Strauss-Kahn is part of their world, and that his conduct is their concern more directly. Do you think this was something that, for whatever reason, elites took more of an interest in than some other sex scandals that we've had recently?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, this was, I think, dwarfed even at the time in the United States by the Anthony Weiner Twittergate scandals, which was, by any reckoning, a much less troubling allegation. But so for the global elites who are your friends, do they feel sympathetic to Dominique Strauss-Kahn? Has he been unfairly maligned in their view?
I think they were kind of oddly pleased at the surprising vindication, perhaps all the more so because it seemed when the accusations first surfaced that most of the people who were on the inside or people who knew a little more than others were saying, oh yeah, he's such a lecher, he's such a troublemaker, this is not a surprise at all. And so to kind of have this exciting reversal is very cinematic.
But do you see this as a vindication? I mean, I don't see it as being a vindication of him. I see it as being an incredibly squalid story where everyone looks terrible, or both Strauss-Kahn and his accuser. I would be baffled if he regains the same public stature he had before this.
That's true. I mean, he's clearly irreparably damaged, and it seems that even if the specific allegations in this case aren't true, there's plenty of bad conduct to go around. But at the same time, I think, and I think you've actually in your writing made some comparisons, or maybe just written recently about the Duke lacrosse scandal, and sort of how these two things might. It occurs to me that these two things do have sort of odd relation. The Duke kids, as far as we can tell, were guilty mostly of just hiring a stripper for a party, who happened to be the wrong stripper. But there is this kind of leap to assume and cry rape, and for everyone to get righteously indignant. And then when you have to scale it back, no one comes out clean, but you can do better and worse.
Right, and this is
once the story washes away.
It's just I have very mixed feelings about this. I think I was mentioning to you earlier that a few years ago I had a jury summons here in Travis County and went in for the jury selection process. It was a rape case, and they asked us all a couple of questions that seemed to be kind of decisive about who was picked for the jury. One of them I thought was a total no-brainer. It was, is it better for an innocent person to go to jail or a guilty person to go free? And so those of us who said it's better for a guilty person to go free were sort of questioned on that. The other question I thought was more, I was wrestling with for longer, I still am kind of wrestling with, I guess, was they asked us, as a juror, would you convict somebody of rape based only on the testimony of the victim? And I said, I'm not sure. And they kind of went around individually and asked us all why we weren't sure. And the prosecutor asked me, do you think people lie about that? And I said, I don't know why they would, but they occasionally do. This is right after the Duke lacrosse case had kind of fallen apart. So that was the example, I think, on everyone's mind. So I got booted from the jury, and so did the rest of us who were kind of wavering on that point. And since then, I just I think that was the right answer. It depends on the testimony, but I don't know how certain to feel about that. Obviously, there's lots of cases where it is only the testimony of the victim.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually never been called up for jury duty, which probably has to do with the confusing patchwork of where I pay taxes and where my license is and a bunch of other things due to the scenic Virginia, Maryland, DC metro area. But it does seem to me that there is this weird kind of deep questioning that happens. I mean, those are pretty serious, kind of profound questions to say, how do we make sense of the testimony of others? Or is it better to let a guilty man go free or an innocent man, be locked up? This is the stuff of at least freshman year philosophy, if not, senior year seminars. And to sort of ask ordinary American citizens these questions as a matter of course in kind of a typical Tuesday humdrum court proceeding always seems sort of remarkable to me. And I think to expect certain pat answers, of course, the goal of these jury selection process isn't to get us to think deeply about the nature of truth. They're just trying to get a favorable jury. So there is a sort of right and wrong answer from the perspective of the lawyers and perhaps the judges in question. But I think it's not surprising that someone like you, who, though I don't know you very well, I will assume is prone to a little bit of second order thinking, a little bit of reflecting back, that you would come out of an experience like that where someone just point blank says, resolve this difficult moral question or resolve this difficult ontological question.
Right. It was challenging, and of course, it creates a systematic bias in juries where, I guess not necessarily a bias towards more punitive jurors, but everyone who kind of got through the questioning process was going to be a pretty a person with a lot of moral clarity and certainty, which I find somewhat hard to have in these cases.
And certainly in the he said, she said cases, which are, I can imagine, the majority of these kinds of cases.
Right.
So
I don't know how to resolve that question. I mean, it seems like the the credibility issues, some of the complaints they cited about the accuser are kind of things that you would ask, well, does that really impugn the person's credibility in general? If they're desperate to immigrate, will they lie on their application? But then there's been some indication in interviews just today and yesterday with the people in the DA's office that they had more general credibility questions about the part of the narrative describing the alleged crime.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, the other angle here, which I feel compelled to bring up since I am, in fact, sitting in the offices of Reason Magazine, is, the angle that because she, was potentially a prostitute, that itself is something that undermines her credibility. Now, obviously, in this specific case, it's highly relevant, but, I think there are lots of other cases where you might be making a very credible accusation of some kind of sexual violence and be a prostitute and probably still find that your credibility was undermined. And that's, of course, just go with our general social view that if you exchange money for sex, somehow you are a less reliable or some moral person. And the idea that this might have been politically motivated, economically motivated, or personally motivated, I think people have very different reactions based on where they think the false accusation springs from.
Right,
and I think that's not particularly admirable if we're just saying, she's a dirty hooker, forget about it.
Right, and there's a similar kind of complaint about the questions about her connections to drug launderers.
Exactly.
That in itself doesn't seem like it doesn't negate the possibility that you can be sexually assaulted, obviously, if you've been involved in money laundering or drug trafficking. And I'm not quite clear whether the DA's office is saying that they think that she's not credible or her story's not true, or whether they're saying that because of the credibility issues, the case would be lost and would be an expensive, scandalous, painful, harrowing ordeal for the city and for the people involved.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's leave this intriguing world of international sex scandals and get a little more down home for you. You've been writing a lot lately about Rick Perry, and you think he might be still a viable contender for the presidential nomination. So
Right.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your hometown boy, or
Sure.
not quite your hometown boy, but
I'll give you my little Perry spiel. It's
let's
funny,
have the
I feel
Perry
like
spiel.
The past few weeks, I feel like every week I'm writing a blog post saying, will Rick Perry run? Here's the latest evidence. I think he's genuinely undecided at this point. There's been a lot of activity from his camp, sort of investigating the booths at the fair in Iowa and New Hampshire that you'd need to pounce on if he gets in the race a few weeks from now. My thinking is that he will decide based on what happens with the Republican field or doesn't happen with the Republican field in the next few weeks. I think that Perry is unlike Mitt Romney or Tim Pawlenty or Ron Paul or any of the others because he has no reason to run and lose. It's not good for his national profile. He doesn't want to be vice president. It's not like he's trying to advance some issue he really cares about and will be happy to have a sort of productive loss in the primaries. He's undefeated. He's an undefeated politician, not in the Sarah Palin sense, but in the actual has not lost an election sense. I think he's happy where he is as governor, so he'll only run if it seems like there's a Rick Perry-shaped hole in the Republican field.
And in our hearts.
And in our hearts. I think that can be taken as given that there is that hole in our hearts. And then, there's been a lot of discussion, even just today on the news, there's articles looking at his ties to the Christian right and his stance on the death penalty over these past 10 years. So people are talking about it. I'm sure he's just weighing his options. He's very, very politically astute, and he really responds to political incentives in a way that some politicians occasionally fail to do because they misgauge themselves or their popularity. But let me ask you though, since because you're in DC, how do you perceive him? Do you see him as being a kind of far right ideologue, or as being a a social conservative predominantly, or as a fiscal guy?
I mean, I think my perception, at least in DC, is that right now people are discounting him probably because he is such an outside the beltway character that, already the field is pretty large and there are lots of colorful characters in the mix. So people who are reporting on this stuff maybe feel like they have their hands full, and Perry's a little harder to cover. But my kind of one close encounter with Perry, for what it's worth, was years ago when I worked at the Weekly Standard magazine. He kind of swung by the offices to do a meet and greet and, hey, don't you guys like me and don't you want to write a profile about me visit. And he had some brochures with him, I think, which declared Texas to be, quote, open for business, which, has both a sort of, you can see how that slogan made it through a bunch of consultants, right? It's open. Texas is full of wide open spaces. Openness is good. He's a conservative, so he's pro-business. He's pro-markets. He thinks that capitalism is, golly, great, but the sort of net result of the slogan "open for business" sounds a little bit too much like, preferential treatment is available to businesses who want to relocate here.
There's and in fact, truth in advertising there.
Right. Well, I was going to say, and in fact, that may not have been entirely accidental, because Texas is, and other states, southern states in particular, are more and more in the habit of bribing big businesses to bring to bring jobs to the state, usually at a cost of, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per job, and then sometimes not with particularly good benefits for the tax base. But I guess the result of that and some other stuff that I've read about Perry suggests that he might be one of those conservatives who doesn't quite get the distinction between being in favor of free markets and being in favor of big business. And I think that's something that would be interesting to see play out in the primaries, because we do have some people in the field who are genuine, you could say kooky, diehard, true free marketeers. I'm sure you saw the Wall Street Journal profile a while back of Michelle Bachmann saying that she reads Von Mises on the beach, and of course there's Ron Paul. So to have someone who is doing what seems to be more of the sort of stereotype, often quite fair stereotype of Republicans as just being the stooges of big business. I'd be interested to hear Perry kind of speak on that and to see whether his presence in the field would pull that debate around at all.
I think it's an interesting paradox you highlight, and it's been very influential. I think that a lot of the southern governors in particular are kind of taking from the Perry playbook in that. Looking back at these 10 years, I think that he's just, his primary motivation or his overarching goal as governor is just bringing business to the state. He catches a lot of press for sort of social issues, but it just animates him so much less than the business stuff. And as you say, if you went to Perry and said, hey, what you're doing is actually industrial policy, we haven't formally had that in this country for quite some time, he would, I think, reject the notion, although that is what it is. In some sectors, if you would elaborate on the kind of reasoning there, in some sectors it's worked out well. In Texas and in other states, I think wind power has been one of the big ones. There's a lot of state tax breaks and subsidies and investments that have put the state into the category of being the top wind producer in the country at this point. Other sectors, I think the stupidest sector is film. That one just seems insane to me. A lot of states do that. Texas does it less than a lot of states, but everywhere else it's like a race to the bottom. I mean, I think Nevada and Montana, it's like more than half of your costs you can just get back from the state. It's so weird. It's like I think that having a film crew in town is going to make the whole state look like sexy and exciting to outsiders. So that one I can't follow the logic there. But yeah, and I think the other issue with his approach to state economic policy is that I don't know how well it translates to a national candidate, because a lot of what he's doing now is luring jobs from other states, especially from California. That gives him his biggest smile when he can get jobs from Los Angeles or something. But you can't really campaign for president on the basis of reallocating jobs between states according to which states you like better.
Right. Well, and there is a kind of zero sum versus bigger pie economic thinking there, and of course, as a short term strategy, and maybe even as a midterm strategy for a state like Texas, it is enough to just say we're just going to be a little bit better than everybody else, or our bribes are going to be a little bit bigger than everybody else, and so we're going to stay afloat while everyone else sinks. But you're absolutely right to point out that that is not a national policy, unless you're willing to say, as a nation, we're going to be a little bit better for corporations than other nations. But that's, I think, not something that most national politicians are willing to say, even Republican politicians. Right now, the United States has one of the highest corporate income tax rates in the world, and we are, otherwise continuing to practice the kind of protectionist policies and punitive tariffs and all kinds of things that other nations use as well. So I doubt that Rick Perry is the guy to say, let's throw open our borders to go, to more truly open trade, and let's welcome the nation's business back to the world's business back to our nation's shores. That's the only thing I can think of that would be this kind of natural extension of what he's done for Texas. Right. If he's not going to do that, I think he's forced to fudge. I think he's just forced to say, hey, I like capitalism and commerce, and we got a lot of that in Texas, and we can have a lot of that here in the United States if you make me president, which may very well play with primary voters, but is not a philosophically consistent or particularly impressive.
I think he could. I guess I wouldn't go quite that far. I think you could probably shift the argument a little bit to say that once you've kind of built a basis of expertise or industry knowledge, then you can build from that in perpetuity. So you can, so you don't have to be as aggressive in courting business if your advantage is the conglomeration of expertise and talent. He also could kind of shift the focus to his record on cutting spending, which is of course very aggressive. And I think he could. I think you're right that he won't make that overarching political philosophy argument, but I think he could take it in certain directions. And also, looking at this business stuff, I think another thing is that a few weeks ago he signed a law that's actually a pretty strict disclosure law with regard to fracking, hydraulic fracturing, which is where you kind of pump water and chemicals under the earth in order to release the natural gas stored there. It's one of the stricter laws in the country, so he's kind of on the forefront of that, even though it is counter to business interests and is in favor of environmental interests. It's a little bit of a counterintuitive stance, I guess, but I think to me that reflects Perry's tendency to respond to politics. And what happened with that was that the fracking had become enough of a growing issue in Texas. A lot of fracking happens around metro areas, Fort Worth in particular. So it was becoming enough of a concern for constituents that people actually did take precedence over the more narrowly construed business interests there. Right.
Well, there's also, I think, at Reason, our science correspondent Ron Bailey has written a lot about fracking, and one thing that I understand from him is that there are business interests in this case are not monolithic against environmental interests, that there are different players who have gotten more or less heavily into that technology based in part on their prognostications about how the political winds are blowing on it. And so there may also be a case of certain established energy interests going against.
Sort of the protectionist of them.
Exactly, some of these newer players. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other folks in the Republican field, because that seems to be all anyone wants to talk about these days anyway. In particular, our Mormon competitors. We've got Mitt Romney, everybody's favorite, long-established Mormon national candidate, and then we have John Huntsman, who often refers to his Mormon heritage,
Right.
Which is a little bit different. And you have written about why you like Mormons, and I think you mostly, or one of your points is just that they're pretty nice, and I would certainly agree with that. But I think I like Mormons more than you like Mormons. So make your best case, and then I will top it.
Okay. Well, I think that kind of, I see one of the main appeals of Mormonism being that it is this kind of historically absurd religion to have arisen. It's just a guy who found a rock in a hat and then started an incredible movement of people and ideas based on that, which became tremendously influential in about 20 years. I think that shows genuine inspiration and courage and enthusiasm and vision. And I feel kind of impressed by that. But then kind of leaping forward to present day, putting aside some of the less savory aspects of the Mormon heritage in the United States, I just don't understand why they get as much flack as they do. They seem like a perfectly reasonable Christian denomination. They're very nice. They're usually good citizens. They're a little bit insular and kind of defensive in the way of embattled peoples all over the place. But I don't see what they've done to create trouble in the modern era for any of us that they inspire such a backlash. But go ahead and tell me how much you love the Mormons.
Well, I think you've made a strong case, and I do think it's interesting that we're having this kind of maybe to call it a Mormon moment overstates it a little bit, but to have these very prominent national Mormon politicians on one side, and then on the other side to have the very successful Broadway musical about Mormonism,
right.
Sort of sweeping New York. There does seem to be something going on that has suddenly required America to get a crash course in our strange homegrown religion. I wonder if one reason that some people are more hostile to Mormonism is because, as you say, it is a sort of surprising and wacky story of the founding of a religion, but pretty much all religions have surprising and wacky founding stories. Everyone else's are just older. And so,
right.
You could say there's a guy who found a rock in a hat. You can say there's a guy who moved a rock off his tomb. You can say, whatever. So there's, I think, for those of us, myself being the us here, I guess, I don't know about your religious background, but for those of us who are not religious, and I also wasn't raised in any faith, the sort of, oh, ha, those Mormons have this crazy founding story from Christians and other people of faith always strikes me as a little peculiar, because,
right.
of course, all religions do have these wacky founding stories, and you can either say they're wacky because they're not true, and they're essentially mythological, or you can say, listen, they're miraculous, and so, of course, they're standouts. But the sort of, to my mind, the thing that's interesting is, Romney is, certainly makes no secret of his faith, but also doesn't make a huge deal out of it. And Huntsman, if anything, is downplaying his faith even more. And I think, from what I understand, he is a little bit of a unorthodox Mormon. I mean, he takes his kids to Hindu temples, and he seems to have strayed from the flock a little bit.
Ceremonial toasts in China.
He's drinking ceremonial toast. He seems to have strayed from the flock a little bit. And so I wonder if in Huntsman, not that I'm a particularly huge backer, but I wonder if in Huntsman we're getting someone who has a lot of the upsides of Mormons. That is this Americanness, this entrepreneurial spirit, this kind of niceness and civic mindedness, without actually getting someone who's more enmeshed in the kind of faith side of the
right.
religion.
Well, it's funny. The point you raised about history is one that I've been thinking about, because I have written this blog post at the Economist's blog, and just kind of asking why don't people like Mormons, open-ended question. And it got a lot of comments, and they were really interesting to read through, obviously kind of unscientific. But there's some sort of patterns that emerge, and one of the big themes was that they commenters really, really hated the idea that Mormons are saying that these things happened in like 1840 or 1820, I think, because they feel like, you know, if you're talking about, you know, 2,000 years ago, it's one thing, but if it's talking about, you know, less than 200 years ago, there's already a substantial historical record of what was going on at the time, and the idea that this other stuff is also happening is just, you know, an insult to their collective intelligence or something. But I don't find that entirely satisfying because, you know, as you say, there are plenty of things described in most religions that are equally implausible, whether they happened yesterday or 10,000 years ago. If you're a Christian, you believe in a virgin birth. That's just not empirically valid according to the usual standards, no matter when it's described as happening. But, you know, what's funny about it is that the way the Mormons are interrogated, not just Romney and Huntsman, but I think most Mormons who are practicing, they're interrogated about this in a way that people usually aren't if they're from another religion. So, you know, you would never challenge them so directly on the articles of their faith because there's this kind of polite assumption, either that it's rude to do so or that they might be part of the religion for cultural family reasons, or they were brought up in it, or it's meaningful to them theologically. You don't assume from somebody's religion that they are a paid-up subscriber to the historical narrative. And we don't send that.
And of course, the other place that you see this is with Scientologists, who, you know, I think people are very, very quick and easy to say, you know, your secret founding story of aliens and thetans and whatever else, you know, well, that's just absurd. You have to defend that. Right. And these are people who say that, you know, God spoke to Moses in a burning bush. So it's not the oldness of the story. You know, I certainly see your commenter's point that we have a little more documentary evidence about whether, you know, voices emanated from bushes 200 years ago than 2,000 years ago, but I still think we can be, or you know, millennia ago, but I still think we can be pretty sure.
Right. And, you know, people do compare Mormons to Scientologists a lot. That was another recurring comment, that they're, people put them on the same footing, even though Mormonism is a much more mainstream and much more populous religion by a factor of, like, about 100,000. I mean, there's about 40,000 Scientologists in the United States and maybe 13 million Mormons around the world. So, yeah, you know, I would love to hear Huntsman or Romney kind of give a speech sort of grappling with this question, because I think it would be fascinating to hear a Mormon, whether they're sort of unorthodox Mormon or whether they're a full-on believer, describe how they relate to that question, how they relate to a broader society that doesn't take their religion seriously. Unfortunately, one of the things we lose in this kind of debate is that people just get defensive and they don't want to engage the question, partly because they've been being maligned for really no good reason. I mean, I see no reason why people do have this bias against Mormons. There's like a third of the country that wouldn't vote for a Mormon for president, which seems like a big number of people who are taking this, you know, way too far.
Right. There's also, I think, one kind of aspect of the Mormon minority, I guess, that I wonder about, and I'd like to, again, hear someone kind of on the inside talk more about, but for the same reasons they probably won't, which is Mormons are very present in certain sections of America's elite. I'm thinking here in particular of my husband went to Harvard Business School, and they say the 3 M's of Harvard Business School are McKinsey, military, and Mormons. They're just a ton of Mormons there, and they formed this kind of great community, and the kind of word on campus, although I don't have confirmation of this, is that they were encouraged not to proselytize on the HBS campus specifically. That this was kind of their compromise to being accepted into the elite realm, such as it is, while retaining their identity. And even though proselytizing is a huge part of what it means to be a Mormon. There are these sort of dispensations where it's agreed that it would be better not to draw attention in this case. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing in the presidential race as well. And we'll continue to see that there's just times when it's better not to draw attention to your minority status.
Right. Even in Mitt Romney's speech about faith that he gave, I guess in 2008 when he was in that campaign, he had this big speech about faith and all the varieties of religious faith and how wonderful it is to have this proliferation of belief in the United States and how it enriches us all culturally. And didn't said Mormon once. He just said, I'm a Mormon. It's my family's religion. I'm not going to reject it. But didn't say a thing about what it means to him or why he likes it. And I think that's kind of what I'd like to hear, because I'm curious. There was a great story in Bloomberg Businessweek a few weeks ago about Mormons in business and the vast number of Mormon CEOs at top companies, and it describes some of the training they do as missionaries, which I hadn't realized, but it's incredibly rigorous training. I mean, you of course you're in a different country. Huntsman was in, I think, China, and Romney was in France. But you only the schedule is entirely regimented. You're very cut off from your family. I think you can't send and receive mail. You can call home twice a year, once on Christmas, once on Mother's Day. It's a very, you can imagine it being a very challenging experience for an 18-year-old who hasn't been far from home and who's maybe lived a kind of sheltered life in the center of their family and community. I'd like to know more about it. I wish we could. I don't know how productive that conversation would be in our current political environment, but I'm holding out hope to hear more about Mormons. They'll be knocking on my door now.
That's going to be the campaign slogan of maybe Romney or Huntsman, holding out hope to hear more about Mormons.
Well, that would be the great upside of a Mitt Romney presidency. We'd all hear a lot about Mormons.
That's true. Although, I wonder if we would get something similar to, what the kind of conventional wisdom is about the concerns about JFK, right? I mean, it's easy to forget now when anti-Catholic bias is, if not completely gone, essentially gone. But there were people who were genuinely concerned that JFK was going to be taking his orders from the Pope, and I wonder if I guess I won't say if, I guess I'll say when, assuming the Mormon candidacy, the Romney candidacy rolls along, there's going to be a point when someone decides to strike that blow, when someone decides to say, will you go into your secret temple in Salt Lake and get your orders once you become president, or whatever it is.
Do you think that'll come from the traditional Christian right, or from the secular, godless left?
I think it'll come from the traditional Christian right. I mean, in no small part because those are going to be the relevant players in the Republican primary. That's going to be a block of votes that there are maybe half a dozen, mostly men who have influence over this block of voters, and at some point, one of them, I think, is going to feel compelled to say, "This guy is not one of us," or to make him testify that he is.
But where else are they going to go? I mean, I wonder how much traction that line of critique will get from the Christian right, because I don't know that they have a beloved candidate at the moment who's the Christian right candidate. I guess maybe Bachman hits on that note, but I don't see her advancing to the late stage primaries necessarily. So if it gets down to 4 or 5 guys, 2 of them are Mormons, one's Mormon, which of the remaining candidates is going to be the alternative?
I think that's a great question, but I think it gets us back to where we started here, which is there is a strong, and to those of us who don't feel it, pretty mysterious anti-Mormon bias, and I think there's a good chance that even without a compelling competing Christian candidate, that there may be certain kind of religious leaders and segments within the Republican Party who will say anybody but a Mormon. The sort of similarity, the strongly felt small differences could overtake a larger discrepancy.
I think that's right. And I think with Mormons too, another thing I think that Another common reaction I've heard about them is that I sense people feeling a little bit defensive about some of the Mormon beliefs, like the kind of good golly, we're all great Mormons. That people find that off-putting more than I would expect. I think people take it almost as an attack on their modes of being if people are sort of rejecting their worldly tastes or interests and implying through their behavior that this sort of abstemious, virtuous way to live is the best way to live. I think that creates some of the discord on the left, especially.
I agree. I actually just realized I'm sitting here sipping coffee while I praise Mormons, so I guess I'm
You're falling, Katherine. You're falling.
I know. I am. Well, true enough. Actually, I think your colleague at the Economist, Will Wilkinson, has some interesting views on this as a former Mormon himself of I think a sort of schismatic Mormon sect or something. So maybe we'll get a second Mormon-tastic edition of Blogging Heads with Will Wilkinson to
I think that would be great.
Expand the knowledge base a little bit.
That'd be awesome.
So we are coming to the end of our time here, but before we go, one other topic that we wanted to talk about was the retiring of the shuttle program. We are now at the sort of end of this fairly long chapter in U.S. space exploration. Some might argue, I suppose, the only chapter, and a lot of people have mixed feelings. One thing that I found remarkable about the debate over the end of the shuttle program and how we're going to re-envision NASA's role is a strange kind of reversal of what you might expect in terms of partisan positions on NASA, with President Obama saying it's time to hand over some of our work in space to private interests, to contract some of this out, and many Republicans holding the line and saying, no, this is part of our, maybe they don't use this term, but some do, national greatness agenda. Right. NASA, one of the goals of NASA is not just to get in and out of space, but also to be inspirational and to kind of stir the hearts of American school children everywhere. So this is a somewhat rare instance where I find myself thinking, man, that Obama guy, he really knows what he's talking about, and he's right.
Wait, so you're against space. You're against this great human endeavor.
So that's the
aspiration and dreams. You're against this, Katherine?
That's me. I'm against aspiration and dreams. That's been my long-standing position. I'm anti-dreams, especially for children.
Right. Yeah.
But I wonder sort of what you think has occasioned this sort of funny reorienting of what you might think of as traditional positions, and whether you're sympathetic at all to the idea that having the state perform this space exploration function is somehow important in, as Obama would say, I suppose, winning the future.
Right, in a great phrase, a very felicitous phrase. I guess I hadn't seen it so much as being a partisan issue. At least here where I am in my little fortress of solitude, it doesn't really feel that way. It was actually Bush who kind of announced plans to retire the shuttle about 5 or 6 years ago, and then Obama just corroborated the decision. But Bush had kind of famously said he wanted to go to Mars, which just didn't get the kind of uptake that I hoped. I guess all these anti-dreamers like you, the silent majority of the country. Obama also wants to go to Mars, so he says, but there's no real proximate plans to do so, and of course, as you say, the need to be in Mars is not necessarily there. It's interesting to look at. I personally am pretty sad about the retiring of the space shuttle, although in a way I think the shuttle's been obsoleting itself, kind of like the Pony Express did, because you have this system that didn't make space travel routine, and of course had a lot of had a couple horrible disasters, but did kind of present the possibility of somewhat predictable space travel for various missions and errands. So having realized that, I think it's pretty straightforward to say this program is expensive. It's not really the cutting edge of technology. Private companies keep threatening to do this anyway. The Russians have a much smaller, lighter capsule they can send to space much more cheaply. And we all see sort of space as an international endeavor now, rather than a Cold War era race to greatness. So on the question of what happens with NASA going forward, they're talking about making more vehicles. It just seems like a situation where we're retiring one vehicle, which is a national symbol of progress and development, and don't have very clear plans to follow through on the next step. So that's something I think that worth keeping an eye on, because I do think that space has had for several generations the benefits that the Republicans are saying it does, of kind of inspiring people or making people feel happy about American science and technology. Do you think that is overblown? I mean, was that just an artifact of the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I do, actually. I think, the image of the first man on the moon was undeniably inspirational and spoke of aspirations for greater things, but it's been a long time, and it's been many, many, many billions of dollars since that happened. And I think I, for one, always find it surprising that people don't, and I think this is true, that this isn't the response that most people have, but that people don't see a similar venture done in the private sector to have the kind of inspirational value that a public sector venture does, right? When these things become privatized, they also become more commonplace. They become cheaper. They become something that you rely on. They become something that you can just buy as a consumer. This is, of course, the aspiration of Virgin Galactic and some of its competitors. And that doesn't seem grand enough for some people. And I guess I think that's a shame, because it's just as impressive to take people into orbit, whether you do it as, sort of embedded in this rhetoric of American greatness, or whether you do it as, pay per pound for your cargo or pay per seat for your people. It's still the same amazing technological feat. And I think, mankind, such as it is, still gets to pat itself on the back for doing cool stuff like that. So I guess I would just say that it is no less inspirational to go to space for $200,000 for a passenger seat on the new Branson vehicle than it is to take a couple billion and send up this rickety old shuttle. So
right. Well, the issue is, I think the distinction is real, though. I mean, if there is a Branson shuttle that gets going, and you can have wealthy tourists on the moon, they're not really doing a new thing. They're just repeating what was arguably the pinnacle of all human achievement ever in the initial moon landing. You wouldn't see a private company. Well, maybe, yeah, in some cases you do.
Well, I think, they are proposing to do new things, right? I mean, NASA hasn't done anything new for many, many, many years. So first, you just have to compare what is to what is. NASA is, supposedly always going to Mars or whatever, but in fact not. But also,
it depends what new means.
Branson and you could talk about Robert Bigelow, who is in the midst of building an orbital hotel where people can go and vacation. And there's also a fair number of private ventures that are in more embryonic stages that are talking about asteroid mining and all kinds of other crazy stuff, which will only be possible if we start to see space as a place of commercial interest, in addition to sort of flag wavy exploration territory.
I think part of the question is is what qualifies as new, and what is new enough to kind of inspire people's hopes and dreams. Is an orbital hotel, it's a new thing, obviously, but is it conceptually that far from an orbiting space station? Is it new enough to get us excited? And if not, what is new enough? I mean, I'm just kind of mentally.
Well, one thing that's new is that you and I might be able to go there someday, and I don't think we were getting on the space shuttle. So,
well, that would be enough
maybe
for me to look forward to, Catherine, and I hope that you would too, even if you don't like that kind of thing.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and I guess maybe I hope to see you at the hotel in space again sometime.
Absolutely. In 2020. See you there. Have a great
afternoon,
Catherine.